I want to learn Chinese. Look at all those characters. They are so pretty. But reading Kobo Abe in the original would be so cool. But China has 1.4 billion people. It's more practical to learn Chinese. But it would be so cool to understand all those words on a sushi bar menu. So I was like this about 10 years ago when I was picking whether to start learning Chinese or Japanese. But eventually my school decided for me by offering only Chinese classes. I've been learning Chinese about 10 years now, on and off, 4 years of active study, and the rest is maintaining my level. And last year I decided to learn Japanese. I devote very limited time to it, and I think my level is somewhere between A1 and A2. I love both languages equally, but I wish I knew a little bit more about them when I was choosing back then. So if you're hesitating which one to pick, in this video I will share insights from a learner's perspective who has been studying both Chinese and Japanese about how these languages are different and maybe help you choose. From the point of view of career prospects and generally the utility of the language, I would have to say that Chinese wins by a large margin here. Maybe some 10 years ago Japanese was leading in this aspect, but now there are so many more vacancies for people with Chinese skills, especially in logistics. For example, I am Russian, and whenever I go to a headhunter resource, there are literally dozens of vacancies in Russian companies who do or want to do business with Chinese, and so they're looking for a person who is native in Russian and fluent in Chinese. I am sure in your country it's pretty much the same way. All such jobs have to do with communicating with Chinese suppliers, looking for new exporters, dealing with some logistics issues, probably translating business correspondence, some contracts from Chinese into your language. Lots of such vacancies. So if you speak Chinese, at least you have this opportunity to pursue. This niche is definitely going to stay there for quite a long time. The next thing is politeness levels. In Japanese, there are different politeness levels, and you will use one verb ending speaking to a friend and another one speaking to a teacher. So it kind of makes Japanese harder for me, at least from the point of view of how much I actually have to memorize, how many verb endings I have to memorize. Chinese is much easier here. There are no politeness levels. You're using pretty much the same language, talking to a stranger, talking to a close friend, and so it makes communication much more relaxed. It doesn't mean that Chinese does not have ways to express respect, it's just that their manners are not determined by the grammar they're using. And it is a big plus for foreign language learners. You don't have to think about how to conjugate a verb to express your respect while talking to a senior person. So yeah, Chinese gets another point here from me. Now we go to the point where I think Chinese loses to any other language on the planet. Well, maybe not to French, but probably to French too. And that is pronunciation. Japanese pronunciation is easier, period. Japanese is not a tonal language. Chinese tones, on the other hand, are a headache literally for every beginner. Even those who never studied Chinese, they know that Chinese pronunciation is devilishly hard. There are many sounds which sound very similar to a foreign ear, all those hushing sounds like z, t, s, sh, zh, ji, qi, xi, they sound so similar. Also, in Chinese, almost every word has a homophone, which means it has a word which sounds exactly the same but has a different meaning. It doesn't mean that you can't learn it or that you can't speak it with a decent pronunciation, but it means that as a learner you will have to be very patient and determined about this aspect of the Chinese language. Now, Japanese pronunciation seems much easier. Of course, there are sounds which do not exist in your mother tongue, as always, and there is also pitch accent, something like a stress in English for multisyllable words, but none of this is crucial to understanding the language. So Japanese gets a big plus here. Another thing that makes Japanese a little bit easier to learn for a European learner is that it has so many loan words. They sound almost the same as in English. For example, computer is computer in Japanese, but in Chinese it somehow became 电脑, which literally means electric brain if you break it character by character. Where Japanese has a loan word, Chinese has a coinage, which means that the language makes new words by combining the elements which already exist in the language. There are tons of examples like this. So Americano coffee, which is Americano in Japanese, somehow becomes 美式咖啡 in Chinese, or American style coffee. Camera becomes 照相机, a gadget for taking photos. And even iPhone, which is iPhone in any other language, somehow becomes 苹果手机 in Chinese. Such vocabulary makes Japanese much easier to learn than Chinese. All you have to do is just to hear this word once, to know that it is a loan word, and to hear the pronunciation, how it sounds, and it is already part of your active vocabulary. In Chinese, it still requires some effort to remember this word, even though when you break it down by character, the logic seems pretty transparent. But still, another point goes to Japanese here. Now, what about grammar? To a newbie, Chinese and Japanese may seem very similar, probably because they both use Chinese characters. But the fact is that the two languages come from two different language families, and so their grammars have absolutely nothing in common. Chinese is an analytic language, which means that the words in a sentence do not change their form. There are no cases, no grammatical gender, no plurals, no conjugations for the verbs, no tenses. The only thing that needs to be mastered is word order. And technically, all Chinese grammar is about putting the words in the correct order. For example, 我去过 means I have been there, but 我过去 means I will come over. So the meaning changes by changing the word order in a sentence. But Japanese is a whole different story. Japanese is an agglutinative language, which means that you attach suffixes to the word stem to express negation, modality, politeness level, or tense. I am very subjective here, but for me as a learner, such grammar is more difficult to learn, simply because of the sheer volume of these suffixes that you need to master to express very basic things, like to make a verb negative. So for grammar, I would give another point to Chinese here. Now, another point which many learners dread when they consider taking Chinese or Japanese is characters, or hanzi as they're called in Chinese, and kanji as they're called in Japanese. For Chinese, you need about 3,000 characters to communicate at a decent level and to be able to read non-adapted texts. Another 2,000 will get you to a near-native level when you can understand business topics, when you can read proper names and serious literature. An educated Chinese person knows about 8,000 characters. Japanese language borrowed Chinese characters many centuries ago, but since Japanese has its own alphabets, katakana for borrowed words and hiragana for grammatical endings, you only need some 2,000 characters, or kanji, to be fluent in Japanese. So judging by the number of characters that you have to learn, Japanese definitely wins. But here is a tricky part. In the 1950s, China had a huge grammar reform which overhauled basically its entire character system and simplified most of the characters, which made the job easier to learn both for the native Chinese people and non-native learners. If you look at Japanese kanji, they look pretty much like traditional Chinese characters, which are only used in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and there are more elements in each character and more strokes. And that's why maybe they're a little bit harder to learn. So in Japanese there is a smaller number of characters, but Chinese characters seem a little bit easier. So I will give another point to Chinese here. If you're aiming in Chinese at a decent intermediate, upper intermediate level, you need only 2,000-3,000 characters, then definitely Chinese wins because these 2,000-3,000 characters are simplified. So all in all, based on my very subjective experience, Chinese has a little bit more points for language learners, but after all, it all boils down to what you are really interested in. So both languages are definitely manageable with enough effort and motivation. The most common question I get is, okay, you understand Chinese, does it mean that you understand Japanese? The answer is definitely no. The languages are 100% indecipherable by ear. A Chinese speaker, no matter native or non-native, does not understand Japanese by listening, even though Japanese borrowed a lot of vocabulary from Chinese. But the thing is that pronunciation of the same vocabulary diverged way too much over all these centuries. It evolved differently both in China and in Japan. So at this point, the two languages are indecipherable by listening. As for the written language, with my Chinese skills, I can roughly understand what the Chinese text is about, but I cannot say what is being said about that thing. For example, I understand that this text is something about the government because there is this character which is zhengfu in Chinese. So this text is telling us something about the government, but since Japanese has a completely different grammar, I cannot say what is being said about the government. Whether it is a negation or an affirmation, whether it is a real story or a hypothetical, a conditional story, whether it is in the past or in the future, these things can only be expressed in grammar, and if you have not learned Japanese grammar, you can't really say, no matter how many characters from this text look familiar. So I would say I understand like some 5% of the text, like what the text is about, what is the topic, but not what is being said about this topic. But if you ask me whether it is easier to learn Japanese after Chinese, then definitely yes. Because I kind of already mastered the most difficult aspect of the language, that is characters. So in Japanese, I love kanji because they're these props that help me understand what the text is about, even if I don't understand anything else. So comment below whether you want to learn Chinese or Japanese, or maybe both. And smash the subscribe button if you like this video and want to receive more language learning tips. 谢谢大家耐心观看，下次再见，拜拜。